The habit begins quietly. A broken cup leads back to a careless hand, which leads back to a moment of distraction, which leads back to a thought that wandered. The mind moves backward almost without permission, tracing causes as if retracing footsteps in fresh snow. It does this not to assign blame, but to restore a sense of order. Something happened, therefore something must have preceded it. This backward pull feels natural, comforting, even necessary. Without it, events feel unmoored. Memory itself relies on this motion, stitching moments into sequences that make life feel continuous rather than scattered. The need is so ingrained that it rarely announces itself. It simply operates, shaping how experience is understood, how stories are told, how responsibility is assigned, how meaning quietly takes form beneath awareness. As this habit matures, it stretches beyond immediate events. Childhood asks where parents came from. Stories ask how kingdoms were founded. Traditions ask who spoke first words, lit first fires, drew first boundaries. Each answer satisfies briefly before revealing a deeper layer beneath it. The backward motion resumes, not because curiosity is insatiable, but because stopping feels wrong. An unexplained beginning leaves a loose thread, and loose threads disturb more than broken patterns. Cultures formalize this discomfort into myths, genealogies, and sacred timelines. Individuals feel it as a low tension, a sense that something essential remains just out of reach. The question of origin persists, not because it promises closure, but because its absence feels like an omission in the fabric of understanding. When the scale widens enough, the question sheds its familiar forms and becomes something heavier. The universe exists. That fact alone carries an implicit demand. Existence feels as though it should point backward toward a moment before itself. The mind applies the same logic it always has, expecting a starting mark, a first step, a definitive before. Yet here, the trail resists being followed. Each proposed beginning seems to hover atop something else, like a word defined using itself. The discomfort sharpens. It is no longer about missing information, but about a broken expectation. The tools that work everywhere else begin to falter, and their failure is felt more emotionally than intellectually. This tension is often mistaken for ignorance. It feels intuitive to assume that unanswered questions persist because the right explanation has not yet been found. But some absences feel different. They do not behave like gaps waiting to be filled. They feel structural, as though the question itself may be misaligned with reality. The idea is unsettling because it reframes the problem. Instead of asking why an answer has not arrived, it suggests asking why the demand for one feels so urgent. The discomfort does not diminish when explanations grow more refined. In some cases, it intensifies. Each answer seems to deepen the sense that something fundamental is slipping through conceptual fingers. The mind struggles here because it is shaped by causality. Memory, learning, and prediction all rely on sequences with beginnings. Even personal identity depends on narrative continuity, on a sense that there was a before that led to a now. When that structure is denied at the largest scale, it produces a quiet cognitive vertigo. Something feels incomplete, not because the universe has failed to explain itself, but because the mind has reached the edge of its accustomed terrain. The disturbance is subtle, but persistent. It lingers beneath explanations, beneath confidence, beneath claims of understanding. surfacing as a feeling that the story is missing its first page. Across eras, this feeling has returned in different forms. Sometimes it appears as reverence, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as certainty proclaimed too quickly. The specific answers change, but the pressure behind the question remains consistent. It is not driven solely by wonder, but by an aversion to ungrounded existence. A universe without an origin feels like a sentence without a capital letter, grammatically unsettling even if perfectly readable. The discomfort is not resolved by declaring the question forbidden, nor by multiplying explanations. It persists because it arises from how cognition organizes reality, not from any single theory about what reality is. What unsettles most is the possibility that the question refuses to stay quiet because it cannot be satisfied. Not temporarily, but ever. The idea that some questions may be unfinishable challenges a deeply held assumption, that inquiry naturally converges toward completion. In daily life, persistence is rewarded. Problems yield to patience. But this expectation may not scale indefinitely. At cosmic boundaries, the demand for a beginning may encounter something that does not conform to sequential thinking. The mind experiences this not as a neutral limit, but as a form of loss. Something expected, almost promised, fails to appear. This sense of loss shapes how every subsequent explanation is received. If the reason for asking the origin question is misunderstood, then each answer risks being distorted by the need it is trying to satisfy. The question positions the listener inside the problem, not as an observer waiting for information, but as a participant whose own cognitive habits are implicated. The unease does not signal failure, it signals proximity to a boundary. What comes next depends on whether that boundary is treated as an obstacle to overcome, or as a feature to be understood, quietly reshaping everything that follows. When beginnings were simple, the world felt closer to the hand and the eye. Birth was seen, fire was made, storms arrived and passed. Seasons returned on time. Causes announced themselves through repetition. Something started because something else could be pointed to, named, remembered. The ground underfoot seemed firm not only physically, but conceptually. Events belonged to cycles that could be learned and retold. Nothing essential felt hidden. Origins were not abstract inquiries, but extensions of lived experience, folded naturally into daily observation. To ask where something came from was to expect an answer shaped like the things already known, bounded by familiarity, resting comfortably within the scale of ordinary life. Early explanations drew their strength from this closeness. A child was born because two lives met. Fire emerged from friction and patience. Rain followed clouds that gathered and darkened. Each beginning fit into a visible chain, and that visibility mattered. It allowed understanding to feel complete. The story of how something began did not need to reach far, only far enough to restore balance. Once told, it settled. There was relief in that settling, a sense that the world could be trusted to make sense of itself if watched carefully enough over time. These explanations were shared, repeated, refined, and carried forward not as hypotheses, but as anchors. They grounded communities in a shared sense of how reality behaved. To know the beginning of something was to know how to live alongside it. Origins were practical as much as symbolic. They explained not only what had happened, but what could be expected again. The future felt less uncertain when the past appeared orderly. This is where certainty quietly took root, not as arrogance, but as emotional alignment with a world that seemed willing to reveal its patterns. As stories accumulated, they grew richer rather than stranger. Creation narratives echoed the rhythms people already lived within. The first light resembled dawn. The first breath mirrored childbirth. The first separation followed the logic of dividing land from water, sky from ground. These stories worked because they spoke the language of experience. They did not stretch imagination beyond recognition. They extended it gently, preserving coherence while offering meaning. The beginning of everything felt like an enlargement of beginnings already known, not a rupture from them. There was comfort in this continuity. It allowed questions to close rather than multiply. An origin story did not invite endless revision. It invited remembrance. Its power came from being emotionally sufficient, not endlessly precise. Once heard, it explained enough to quiet the restlessness that follows uncertainty. The listener did not feel compelled to dig further. The story had edges. It ended where understanding could rest. In that resting, something important happened. The mind relaxed its demand for deeper causes. Over time, however, the world expanded. Not suddenly, but subtly. Distances grew. Patterns became less predictable. Events that once fit neatly into cycles began to resist repetition. The sky no longer behaved like a familiar ceiling. The ground no longer felt like the center of all motion. As observation sharpened, explanations had to stretch further. Beginnings that once felt obvious started to blur at their edges. The stories still worked, but they worked differently. They soothed rather than resolved. This shift did not erase older certainty. It transformed it. Ancient explanations were not discarded because they failed, but because they no longer matched the scale of what was being noticed. The world began to feel larger than the stories designed to contain it. What had once been emotionally sufficient now felt incomplete. Not wrong, but insufficiently spacious. The unease that followed was quiet at first. It appeared as curiosity rather than doubt. But curiosity has a way of loosening foundations. As explanations grew more precise, they also grew less imaginable. The language of origins moved away from the body and toward abstraction. Beginnings were no longer things one could witness or reenact. They became descriptions that required trust rather than recognition. Something was gained in accuracy, but something else thinned. The warmth of narrative closure faded, replaced by open-endedness. The question of origin no longer settled into a story that could be held. It hovered, unresolved, demanding continued attention. What was lost was not truth, but a particular kind of coherence. Older stories aligned with how the mind prefers to organize experience. They offered beginnings that felt proportional to human life. When that proportion dissolved, so did a sense of containment. The universe no longer felt like a place with a clear first chapter. It began to resemble a text without a visible opening line. The discomfort this produced was not immediate, but cumulative, building quietly as explanations advanced without offering the same emotional resolution. This is where nostalgia quietly enters the conversation. Not as a longing for ignorance, but for a time when understanding felt whole. The clarity of earlier beginnings came at a cost, that was invisible then. It required the world to remain small enough to be narrated completely. As that condition vanished, so did the ease of closure. The mind adapted, but not without friction. Precision replaced familiarity, and certainty became conditional rather than shared. The calm of those earlier explanations now stands in contrast to a modern unease that does not announce itself loudly. It hums beneath knowledge, beneath confidence, beneath progress. The realization emerges slowly. Clarity once came bundled with limits we did not notice while living inside them. As those limits fell away, so did the quiet satisfaction they provided. What remains is not confusion, but a more fragile sense of grounding, setting the stage for fractures that will soon become impossible to ignore. The moment the story broke did not arrive with an announcement. There was no clear line where one way of understanding ended and another began. It emerged gradually as an accumulation of small adjustments that quietly changed the shape of explanation itself. At first, the universe still felt narratable. Causes could be traced, sequences arranged, beginnings implied even if not directly observed. But over time, the language used to describe those beginnings began to drift away from the language the mind was built to understand. What replaced story was not confusion, but something colder and more precise, something that behaved less like memory and more like reconstruction. This shift carried an emotional weight that often goes unacknowledged. When origins were framed as stories, they invited participation. One could follow them, retell them, feel their internal logic settle into place. Even when the details were unfamiliar, the structure was recognizable. There was a first moment, followed by consequences, leading forward into the present. Meaning flowed along that sequence. When explanation began to rely instead on extrapolation, on reasoning backward from present conditions using abstract relationships, the sense of narrative footing weakened. The universe no longer began because something happened. It began because equations, when extended far enough, suggested it must. This change altered not just what was said, but how it felt to understand. A story allows room for intuition. It accommodates metaphor, sequence, and emotional resonance. Mathematical reconstruction asks for a different kind of trust. It does not offer images that can be carried easily. It offers consistency instead. The beginning becomes less like an event and more like a boundary condition. For the mind accustomed to stories, this feels like standing on ground that explains itself perfectly while offering no place to stand. As explanations grew more refined, they also grew more detached from sensory experience. The universe's origin was no longer something that could be pictured as a moment in time. It became a limit approached by calculation, a point where familiar concepts blurred and lost their ordinary meaning. Time itself began to behave strangely near this boundary, no longer acting as a simple backdrop against which events unfolded. The narrative impulse, which expects a before and an after, found itself facing an origin that resisted being placed inside a sequence at all. This is where confusion entered, not as ignorance, but as a mismatch between understanding and imagination. The explanations made sense internally. They followed their own rules with remarkable discipline. Yet they refused to translate into anything the mind could hold comfortably. The universe's beginning could be described, but not visualized. It could be reasoned about, but not felt. This gap created a subtle sense of unreality, as though something could be true without ever becoming real in the way other truths do. The emotional impact of this realization was profound, even if rarely acknowledged directly. For centuries, understanding had meant bringing the unknown closer, making it familiar enough to integrate into lived experience. Now, understanding began to push the unknown further away. The more accurate the description became, the less it resembled anything recognizable. The mind was asked to accept that reality might be governed by structures that do not care whether they can be imagined. This acceptance did not come easily. It carried with it a sense of loss that often masqueraded as skepticism or discomfort. This was not a failure of explanation, but a transformation of it. The universe did not become less intelligible. It became intelligible in a way that bypassed narrative entirely. Instead of asking what happened first, explanations asked what must have been true for what is observed now to exist. The beginning was no longer an origin in the storytelling sense. It was an inference. This reframing subtly displaced the listener. Instead of standing at the start of a story and moving forward, one stood at the present and looked backward through layers of abstraction. For many, this produced a quiet disorientation. The question of origin still lingered, but it no longer behaved the same way. It could not be resolved by imagining a first moment unfolding into everything else. The beginning became something like a mathematical horizon, defined not by events, but by limits. Approaching it did not reveal more detail, but less. Familiar concepts thinned out, leaving behind relationships that felt real but inaccessible. The universe's story no longer opened with a scene. It opened with conditions. This disorientation was often mistaken for a lack of comprehension. In reality, it reflected a deeper tension. The mind can follow logic without forming images, but it does not feel complete doing so. There is a difference between knowing that something works and feeling that it makes sense. Modern origin explanations often satisfy the first requirement while leaving the second untouched. They ask for acceptance without offering the emotional closure that stories once provided. The result is an uneasy kind of understanding, one that feels provisional even when it is internally sound. As this shift settled in, debates about the universe's beginning took on a new tone. They became less about competing stories and more about competing frameworks. The disagreements were no longer primarily narrative, but structural. Each explanation offered coherence on its own terms, yet none restored the sense of intuitive grounding that earlier stories had provided. The discomfort this generated was not limited to specialists. It filtered outward, shaping how the broader question of origin was felt, rather than how it was answered. What emerged was a shared sense that explanation had outrun imagination. The universe could now be described in ways that resisted being pictured, and this resistance mattered. Humans do not relate to reality through correctness alone. They relate through coherence, through the ability to place themselves within an understanding. When that placement becomes impossible, something essential shifts. The universe may still be knowable, but it becomes harder to feel connected to what is known. This is where humility quietly enters. Not the humility of admitting ignorance, but the humility of recognizing cognitive limits. The realization dawns that the demand for a beginning shaped like a story may reflect the structure of the mind more than the structure of reality. This does not invalidate the question, but it reframes it. The discomfort surrounding modern origin theories may say less about their truth and more about the expectations brought to them. Yet even this reframing does not resolve the tension. Knowing that imagination has limits does not eliminate the desire to imagine. The question remains unsettled, hovering between explanation and experience. Something can be consistent without feeling complete. Something can be real without ever becoming familiar. The story did not break because it was replaced by error. It broke because it was replaced by something that does not behave like a story at all. This shared confusion becomes a quiet bond. The unease is not personal failure, but a collective encounter with scale and abstraction. To feel lost here is not to misunderstand, but to understand deeply enough to sense what has been left behind. The universe's origin is no longer a tale waiting to be told. It is a structure waiting to be accepted. Even as the mind searches for narrative ground that may no longer exist. What follows grows out of this fracture, carrying forward both the power of explanation and the lingering ache of lost story. As the trail is followed backward far enough, something subtle begins to fail. The movement that once felt so natural, the steady retracing of causes, starts to lose traction. Earlier, every step backward revealed another foothold. Now the ground thins. The language that carried explanation so confidently begins to hesitate. Words like cause, before, and beginning still appear, but they no longer behave as expected. They point toward something that refuses to stay fixed, something that shifts under inspection. The mind senses that it is approaching an edge, not of knowledge, but of applicability. Near this edge, intuition becomes unreliable. The habits that once organized understanding start to misfire. Time no longer feels like a neutral backdrop against which events unfold. It becomes entangled with the events themselves, losing the clean separation that made earlier and later feel meaningful. The idea of tracing anything backward presumes a stable direction, a consistent flow. When that flow destabilizes, the act of tracing begins to resemble pushing against a current that is no longer there. The question persists, but the framework supporting it grows fragile. Language strains first. It was shaped to describe experiences within a certain range, where sequences behave and causes follow effects. At the boundary, these assumptions fray. To ask what came before requires that before still functions as a concept. But when time itself becomes unstable, the word loses its anchor. It gestures toward a direction that may not exist in the way the mind expects. The question does not become forbidden. It becomes ambiguous. Its grammar remains intact, while its meaning quietly dissolves. Causality suffers a similar fate. In familiar contexts, it feels almost moral in its clarity. One thing leads to another, and responsibility can be traced. Near the supposed beginning, this chain no longer links cleanly. Causes do not line up neatly behind effects. The idea of one thing producing another assumes a background where production makes sense. At the edge, that background warps. Effects may not point cleanly to causes, and causes may not precede what they explain. The mind resists this not because it is illogical, but because it violates deeply ingrained expectations. This resistance often manifests as frustration. It feels as though something essential is being withheld. But the sensation may be misleading. The problem may not be missing information, but the insistence on using tools designed for a different domain. Questions forged in a world of stable time and clear sequences are being forced into a regime where those features dissolve. The discomfort arises not from ignorance, but from misapplication. Familiar concepts are being stretched beyond their breaking point, and their failure feels like mystery rather than mismatch. At this boundary, explanation begins to loop. Attempts to clarify rely on terms that require clarification themselves. Each step forward seems to lean on assumptions that no longer hold. The mind experiences this as vertigo, a sense of circling without progress. It is tempting to interpret this as a sign that something crucial lies just beyond reach. Yet it may also indicate that the direction of inquiry has become misaligned. Pushing harder does not bring resolution. It deepens the sense of instability. This is the point many explanations pass over quickly. The discomfort is acknowledged, then smoothed away with technical language or provisional statements. The boundary is treated as temporary, a place that future insight will eventually illuminate. But there is another possibility that lingers beneath this optimism. The edge may not be something to cross, but something to understand as an edge. The breakdown itself may be the information, signaling that the question has reached a domain where its assumptions no longer apply. What makes this unsettling is that the question still feels valid. The urge to ask what came before does not fade simply because the answer resists formation. Habit presses forward. The mind insists on continuity, on a starting point that restores narrative order. To abandon the question feels like surrender. Yet to persist without adjusting it leads only to deeper confusion. The tension between these impulses defines this boundary region, where inquiry neither advances nor resolves. Here, the idea of a beginning begins to lose its familiar shape. It no longer resembles a moment waiting to be discovered. It behaves more like a limit, a place where description thins rather than accumulates. Approaching it does not reveal more detail, but erodes the categories used to describe detail at all. This erosion is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost polite, as concepts simply stop working as intended. The mind notices only when it tries to use them and finds nothing to grasp. The anxiety this produces is not trivial. It touches something foundational. Human understanding relies on the assumption that questions, if properly framed, lead somewhere. To encounter a question that appears structurally unanswerable challenges that faith. It suggests that inquiry itself has boundaries, not just answers. This realization does not invalidate curiosity, but it complicates it. The drive to know collides with the recognition that knowing may require letting go of certain forms of asking. This collision often produces paradox. Statements appear that feel simultaneously meaningful and empty. Time both exists and fails to apply. Beginnings both occur and cannot be located. These paradoxes are not riddles designed to tease resolution. They are symptoms of conceptual strain. The mind is attempting to force coherence, where coherence, as previously understood, may not exist. The resulting tension feels like standing at the edge of a cliff that offers no clear view below, only the awareness of depth. Yet even here, something important is happening. The breakdown of intuition exposes its structure. By failing, familiar concepts reveal the conditions under which they normally succeed. Time, causality, and sequence show themselves not as universal truths, but as effective tools within a certain range. Their limits do not diminish their usefulness elsewhere. They simply mark the boundary beyond which different forms of understanding may be required, forms not yet fully articulated. The sense that this is forbidden territory adds to its pull. It feels like a place most explanations quietly step around, preferring to focus on what can be said cleanly. To linger here is uncomfortable. It invites uncertainty without promising closure. But it also offers clarity of a different kind. It clarifies why the question of origin feels so persistently unsettled. The unease is not a flaw in explanation, but a signal that the question itself is brushing against the edge of its own validity. At this edge, the listener is no longer outside the problem. The habits of thought that brought the question into being are now implicated in its difficulty. The discomfort becomes shared rather than abstract. It is not that answers have failed to appear. It is that the act of asking has revealed its own limits. This realization does not end inquiry, but it changes its character. The path forward will not restore familiar ground. It will move sideways, into reflections on why the question feels unavoidable, even as it resists resolution, carrying the inquiry deeper into territory where certainty gives way to something quieter and more fragile. Modern explanations do not arrive like conclusions. They arrive like doorways. Each one opens onto a corridor that extends further than expected, branching into additional passages rather than narrowing toward a final room. The feeling is not resolution, but expansion. Attention is eased in one place, only to reappear elsewhere in a new form. What once felt like a single question begins to resemble a network of related uncertainties, each connected yet unwilling to collapse into a single answer. Theories no longer close the story. They loosen it. This shift changes how understanding is experienced. Earlier explanations aim to still the restless motion of inquiry. These newer frameworks do something quieter and more unsettling. They invite the mind to move differently, to accept that coherence may come without completion. Each proposal carries an internal elegance, a sense that it fits its own logic cleanly. Yet when followed outward, that same elegance generates further demands. If this is how things began, then what allowed that beginning to take this form? The relief is real, but it is temporary. What distinguishes these frameworks is restraint. They do not claim to reveal a first moment in any familiar sense. Instead, they describe conditions under which beginnings might emerge or cease to be meaningful altogether. This subtle shift matters. The focus moves away from pinpointing an origin and toward mapping possibilities. The beginning becomes less like a fact to be discovered and more like a feature that depends on perspective. Each explanation holds steady within its own boundaries while quietly gesturing beyond them. The effect on certainty is delicate. At first, there is satisfaction in seeing a long-standing tension addressed. Something that once seemed impossible to frame now has a shape, however abstract. But this satisfaction carries a price. The shape does not sit alone. It implies others. If this framework holds, then reality may be larger, stranger, or less singular than previously assumed. The comfort of explanation is paired with the discomfort of implication. Understanding deepens, but grounding thins. These theories do not compete like rival stories. They coexist like overlapping maps. Each highlights a different aspect of the terrain while leaving others faint or unexplored. None claims to be the final word. They function more like lenses than answers. Looking through one brings certain patterns into focus, while blurring others. Switching lenses does not reveal a hidden truth beneath them all. It reveals how much depends on the act of looking itself. This multiplicity alters the emotional landscape of inquiry. The drive to settle on a single explanation gives way to a quieter curiosity about how explanations behave. Progress is no longer measured by how many questions are eliminated, but by how thoughtfully they are transformed. A good framework does not silence doubt. It redirects it. It teaches the mind where to apply pressure and where to let go. In this way, understanding becomes less about possession and more about navigation. Each proposal resolves a specific discomfort while exposing new ones. One may ease the problem of a first moment by dissolving it into a broader structure, only to raise questions about why that structure exists at all. Another may explain certain features of the present by appealing to deeper patterns while leaving the origin of those patterns untouched. The pattern repeats. Answers arrive paired with larger unknowns. The balance between clarity and mystery shifts, but it is never eliminated. This dynamic can feel destabilizing if approached with the expectation of closure. It can feel liberating if approached differently. Theories at this frontier are not promises of finality. They are invitations to think more flexibly about what explanation can reasonably provide. They suggest that understanding may occur not at the end of inquiry, but within it, in the act of holding multiple possibilities without forcing them into premature alignment. The mind responds to this in complex ways. There is awe, but it is a controlled awe, one that does not depend on spectacle. There is uncertainty, but it is bounded, shaped by internal coherence rather than chaos. The unease that once came from not knowing where the universe began now shifts toward a different unease. The recognition that knowing may always be contextual. Certainty becomes local rather than absolute. It holds within a framework, not beyond it. This reframing challenges a deeply rooted habit. The desire for a single, definitive origin is not merely intellectual. It is emotional. It promises a point of rest, a place where questions can stop. These modern frameworks refuse that promise without dismissing the desire behind it. They acknowledge the impulse while declining to satisfy it in familiar ways. The result is a quieter tension, less dramatic but more persistent, as the mind learns to live without a final anchor. Understanding, in this environment, becomes an activity rather than a state. It happens in the process of comparing frameworks, noticing where each succeeds and where it strains. It emerges in the recognition that explanation is not a ladder leading upward, but a landscape to move through. Each step reveals new terrain rather than a higher vantage point. The satisfaction comes from orientation, not arrival. This orientation requires a shift in what counts as progress. If every explanation demands a deeper explanation, then progress cannot mean reaching the deepest layer. It must mean asking questions that are better aligned with the structure of reality. A question that opens productive pathways may be more valuable than one that seeks to end inquiry altogether. In this sense, progress is measured not by answers accumulated, but by questions refined. The fragility of certainty becomes apparent here. It is not that certainty vanishes, but that it becomes conditional. It depends on context, on assumptions, on the scope within which a framework is applied. This conditionality does not weaken understanding. It makes it more honest. It acknowledges the limits of what can be claimed without abandoning the pursuit of coherence. Theories become tools rather than monuments. Leaving this terrain too quickly risks missing something subtle. The frontier is not marked by dramatic revelations, but by a gradual softening of expectations. The need for final answers loosens, replaced by an appreciation for how much can be understood without them. Certainty is no longer the goal. Insight is. Theories that open more doors than they close do not fail to explain. They succeed in a different register, one that values depth over closure. As this perspective settles in, the question of origin changes tone. It becomes less accusatory, less demanding. It is no longer a demand for a single starting point, but an exploration of how beginnings are framed, reframed, and sometimes set aside. The universe's origin remains unresolved, but not empty. It is rich with structure, implication, and carefully held uncertainty. What follows from here will not simplify the question. It will deepen it, drawing attention to why the need for certainty persists, even as certainty itself grows increasingly delicate. Eventually, the conversation returns to the scale of a single life. Questions about the universe do not stay politely distant. They seep into ordinary thinking, into how a person understands their own presence in the world. When the origin remains unfinished, existence can feel slightly unmoored, as if it lacks a formal justification. People rarely articulate this directly, yet it shapes how significance is felt. A finished beginning promises placement. It says, you belong somewhere in a story already written. An unfinished one quietly removes that reassurance, leaving individuals to confront meaning without an inherited starting point to themselves alone. Historically, origins supplied a sense of permission. If the universe began for a reason, then being here felt sanctioned by something larger. Purpose flowed downward from that premise. Without it, meaning appears to lose its external sponsor. This does not erase value, but it changes its source. Significance becomes something generated rather than received. For some, this shift feels like freedom. For others, it feels like exposure. The absence of a settled beginning removes a protective ceiling, leaving existence open, vast, and personally accountable in ways no tradition can predefine without consequence or comfort from outside the self alone now. This quiet pressure surfaces in moments that seem unrelated to cosmology. Decisions about careers, relationships, or legacy often carry an unspoken backdrop. If existence has no guaranteed beginning, then no path arrives prevalidated. Choices feel heavier because they cannot be deferred to destiny or design. The unfinished origin relocates responsibility inward. Meaning becomes something assembled through action, care, and continuity, rather than discovered waiting intact. This can deepen engagement with life, but it can also intensify doubt, especially when effort does not yield clarity or reassurance about ultimate direction beyond the present moment that quietly passes without explanation given anywhere. Identity is shaped by stories of origin, personal as much as cosmic. People ask where they come from to understand who they are. When the largest origin remains unresolved, smaller identities feel less anchored. This does not dissolve them. but it loosens their boundaries. Belonging shifts from inheritance to participation. Communities, values, and purposes must be maintained rather than assumed. The unfinished beginning invites a different kind of grounding, one based on relation and continuity, instead of fixed cosmic placement within an indifferent universe that offers no guarantees beyond what people make together over time patiently without external assurance remaining. This shift subtly affects how mortality is felt. A completed origin often implies a completed arc, a sense that existence is framed from start to finish. When the beginning is unfinished, endings feel less symmetrical. Death no longer mirrors a clear arrival. It becomes a cessation without narrative closure. For some, this sharpens fear. For others, it heightens presence. Moments gain weight precisely because they are not anchored to a grand opening scene that explains why they exist at all within an ordered story already complete from beginning to end, as tradition once promised, with certainty assured by origin myths. Unfinished origins also influence how wonder is experienced. Wonder once leaned toward reverence for a completed creation. Now it leans toward openness. The absence of closure does not extinguish awe, it redistributes it. Awe shifts from answers to processes, from beginnings to continuities. The question becomes less about where everything started, and more about how complexity persists at all. This form of wonder is quieter, less theatrical, but often more durable in daily life, where uncertainty accompanies routine rather than spectacle and survives without ceremonial closure, or definitive explanations offered by any authority, external or internal, to human experience alone. There is also a social cost. Shared origin stories once synchronized meaning across groups. They offered a common reference point, a reason to agree about why existence mattered. As that reference fades, meaning becomes more plural. This plurality can enrich understanding, but it can also fragment it. Without a common beginning, conversations about purpose drift more easily into conflict or isolation. The unfinished origin does not cause division, but it removes a stabilizing backdrop that once absorbed disagreement by appealing to a shared cosmic narrative that felt unquestionable and emotionally sufficient for most people across generations without contest or debate. Yet something is gained alongside this loss. When meaning is no longer guaranteed by origin, it becomes responsive. It can adapt to circumstance, suffering, and change. Purpose no longer depends on alignment with a cosmic plan. It depends on responsiveness to reality as encountered. This can foster a more intimate ethics, one grounded in care rather than destiny. The unfinished beginning leaves space for responsibility to arise from proximity rather than prescription delivered from distant metaphysical authority or inherited narrative certainty that excuses disengagement from immediate human needs and lived consequences of shared existence in fragile contexts without answers available. For many, the discomfort of an unfinished origin operates quietly. It appears in moments of reflection rather than crisis. A sense that life must justify itself without cosmic endorsement can be heavy, but it can also be clarifying. It strips away assumptions that meaning arrives ready-made. What remains is the task of meaning-making itself. This task can feel daunting, yet it also affirms agency. Existence does not wait to be explained before it matters within everyday acts of attention and care shared with others under uncertain skies, without guarantees or final assurances about cosmic purpose or justification from origins unknown. Do we need a beginning to justify existence? The question lingers not as a demand for proof, but as a habit of thought. It reflects a desire for external validation, a wish for reality to confirm that being here was intended. When that confirmation does not arrive, the challenge becomes internal. Meaning must be affirmed without appeal to first causes. This does not diminish wonder. It relocates it into the present tense of living, where significance is practiced, rather than inferred from abstract origins beyond immediate experience or deferred explanations awaiting future discovery to validate existence once and for all. Wonder can survive without closure, but it changes character. It becomes less about marveling at answers and more about sustaining attention. The unknown no longer signals a temporary gap. It becomes a permanent companion. This companionship can feel unsettling, yet it also keeps curiosity alive. Instead of racing toward resolution, thought lingers. It learns to dwell. The unfinished origin teaches patience with ambiguity, a skill rarely celebrated but deeply necessary in a world where certainty is limited and explanation has edges that resist closure despite intellectual effort and technological reach into unknown regimes of understanding beyond habit or comfort zones. Everyday life rarely references cosmology explicitly, yet its influence persists. How people weigh success, failure, or legacy is shaped by whether existence feels framed or open-ended. An unfinished origin subtly encourages presence over conclusion. It asks not where everything began, but how one participates now. This shift does not answer existential questions, it reframes them. Meaning becomes less about justification and more about engagement, less about origins and more about ongoing relation with others across uncertain time and fragile circumstance, without promised resolution from any cosmic narrative or final explanation waiting at the end of inquiry about existence itself alone. The human cost of an unfinished origin is not despair. It is adjustment. It requires learning to live without narrative guarantees while still caring deeply about outcomes. This adjustment is uneven. Some resist it, seeking certainty elsewhere. Others adapt, finding meaning in contribution rather than conclusion. The universe may never offer a finished beginning, but life continues regardless. The question then shifts quietly. Not why everything began, but how to live well amid unanswered origins that quietly shape perspective and value in daily decisions, relationships, and commitments made without certainty or cosmic endorsement from first causes or final answers ever. The story does not end where certainty fades. It changes texture. What remains is not an absence, but a different kind of presence, one that does not announce itself as an answer. The universe's origin stays unresolved, yet the search continues, not as a march toward completion, but as a sustained conversation between curiosity and restraint. This conversation has shaped how understanding grows, how questions evolve, and how meaning is approached without insisting on finality. The unfinished beginning becomes less a problem to solve and more a condition to inhabit. When viewed this way, the lack of closure stops feeling like failure. It begins to resemble an ongoing relationship. Curiosity presses forward, humility pulls back, and between them a space opens where understanding can deepen without hardening. This space is not empty. It is active, filled with refinement, revision, and the steady adjustment of expectations. The story remains open not because knowledge has stalled, but because the form of knowing has changed. Completion is no longer the measure of success. There is a quiet maturity in recognizing this shift. It asks for patience rather than conquest. Instead of demanding that reality conform to the mind's preferred structure, it invites the mind to observe its own habits of asking. The desire for a definitive beginning reveals something important about human cognition. It shows how deeply narrative, sequence, and cause are woven into understanding. At the same time, the resistance of the universe to provide a clean starting point reveals that these tools, powerful as they are, may not apply everywhere. This recognition does not diminish wonder. It refines it. Wonder becomes less about dramatic revelation and more about sustained attention. The universe does not need to resolve itself to remain compelling. Its ability to generate questions that endure across generations may be part of what makes it meaningful. The unfinished origin holds attention precisely because it cannot be closed. It continues to invite participation, not by promising answers, but by offering depth. In this light, uncertainty gains a different resonance. It is no longer a temporary state awaiting resolution. It becomes a stable feature of the landscape. Learning to live with it does not mean abandoning rigor or curiosity. It means accepting that understanding may arrive in layers rather than endpoints. Each layer adds clarity without erasing mystery. The story grows richer, not narrower, as it unfolds. The presence of minds capable of asking these questions becomes part of the narrative itself. A universe that gives rise to beings who seek its beginning, even when that beginning resists articulation, carries a subtle symmetry. The search becomes reflective. In attempting to understand where everything comes from, the universe turns back on itself through thought. This reflexivity does not solve the origin problem. It reframes it. The act of questioning becomes as significant as the object of the question. This reframing alters the emotional tone of inquiry. The urgency softens. The need for final answers loosens its grip. What remains is a quieter engagement, one that values coherence without demanding closure. The unfinished story becomes something to walk alongside rather than overcome. Each generation contributes not by finishing it, but by extending its reach, clarifying its contours, and learning how to hold its uncertainty with care. There is intimacy in this approach. It acknowledges that knowledge is not only accumulated, but lived. The questions asked about the universe's origin shape how people think about time, belonging, and responsibility. They influence how progress is understood and how limits are respected. An unfinished beginning does not paralyze meaning. It relocates it into the ongoing effort to understand without domination. The idea that some stories gain meaning precisely because they resist completion runs counter to familiar instincts. Closure feels safe. Endings feel earned. Yet many of the most enduring human pursuits lack final resolution. Ethics, art, and identity are not solved once and for all. They persist through engagement, reinterpretation, and renewal. The universe's origin may belong to this category. Its power lies not in being concluded, but in remaining open enough to sustain inquiry. Seen this way, the search itself becomes part of the origin story, not as a solution, but as an expression. The universe does not merely exist, It produces conditions under which it can be questioned. That capacity for questioning loops back into the narrative, blurring the line between subject and object. The beginning is no longer a distant event. It is entangled with the present act of seeking, with the ongoing attempt to make sense of existence from within. This does not mean abandoning the hope for deeper understanding. It means adjusting what deeper understanding looks like. It may not arrive as a single illuminating answer. It may arrive as a growing sensitivity to where questions apply and where they begin to strain. This sensitivity is not resignation. It is discernment. It allows inquiry to continue without forcing it into shapes it cannot sustain. Leaving the story unfinished does not diminish its gravity. It preserves it. The open ending invites reflection rather than consumption. It resists being reduced to a conclusion that can be filed away. Instead, it stays active, shaping thought long after the immediate question fades from view. The universe's origin remains unresolved, but it continues to matter. Not because it promises an answer, but because it keeps attention alive. What kind of universe produces minds that ask questions they may never finish answering? The question lingers without demanding response. It gestures toward a relationship rather than a conclusion. Perhaps the search is not a detour from the story, but an extension of it. Perhaps the unfinished origin is not waiting behind us, but unfolding alongside us, carried forward through curiosity, restraint, and the quiet acceptance that some stories are meaningful precisely because they remain open.